Hey, welcome back to the shop. Now y'all have asked me a lot of questions on how I made the homemade tracks for my circular saw to turn it into a track saw. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how that's done. And don't worry if you don't have a shop full of tools, because the only things we're going to need today is something to take measurements with and our circular saw. So let's get started. Oh, and I'm still hoping that one day I'll land that Festool sponsorship, so let's keep this video just between us, okay? Thanks. Okay, so I know some of you are wondering why a track is even necessary at all with the circular saw. Well, I'm sure you're aware that cutting freehand, you're not going to get perfectly straight results. You're going to have some deviation as you're making the cut. So the next option would be to use some sort of a guide, such as a straight edge. Now this can work great. The saw rides against the straight edge and you can get perfectly straight cuts. However, when you are using a guide like this, you have to account for the distance between the edge of the saw plate and the blade. So when you're making your setup, if you wanted to cut 3 inches off of this piece of plywood, you would make your measurement for the 3 inches that you want to cut, and then you have to make an additional measurement for the distance between the edge of the plate and the blade, which in my case is another 5 inches. So you have to remember that you need a total of 8 inches away to set your guide. So this creates a lot of room for error because you're taking multiple measurements and you're doing several setups to try to make the cut. So this is where a track saw and a track becomes so useful, because if you want that 3-inch cut, you just set the track right on that 3-inch line, and now your saw rides on the track and cuts exactly where the edge of the track is. But we can make this with some plywood or MDF for our circular saw and save a lot of money if you're not ready to buy something such as an expensive track saw. Now when it comes to the material for making your homemade track, I recommend using 1/2-inch MDF or plywood. And this is because the thickness of the material is going to take away from the depth of the cut you can make with your circular saw. Since the saw is riding on the track, the thicker the material, the less blade you have sticking below. So if you go with 3/4 of an inch, you're losing a lot of capacity of your saw. However, if you go to the other extreme and use something like a 1/4-inch plywood or MDF, the track just becomes too flimsy and too easy to damage. So I've found a happy medium is to use 1/2-inch material. Since we're just using our circular saw to build this, I'm going to use the factory edge of my plywood to make my guide. That's going to ensure that I get a nice straight edge. First I'll make a mark 3 inches from the edge and run that all the way down the length of the plywood. Then I'll use my circular saw to freehand cut this piece off. It doesn't really matter if this cut is perfectly straight, since we're going to be using the factory edge for our guide and not the side that we're cutting. And next we need to cut the base for the saw. So measure your circular saw from the blade to the edge of the base under the motor. For my saw, this is 5 inches. So we're going to add another 6 inches to account for the guide and to leave some space for clamps. This comes to a total of 11 inches. So I'll mark the plywood and I'm going to make this cut freehand as well. Okay, so now it's time to assemble our jig. Make sure you have the factory edge of our guide rail facing towards you, and then measure 2 inches from the other side and mark the location of the guide. I'm going to use glue to hold this guide rail in place. I'm going to apply a generous amount and then use a rubber roller to spread it out evenly. Now I'll flip the guide rail over into place and make sure that it's lined up with the marks I made earlier. You also want to make sure that you still have the factory edge facing the wide part of your base. Use a couple of clamps to hold the guide rail in place to keep it from sliding around, and then just use whatever heavy objects you have lying around just to add some weight to make sure you get good glue adhesion. Make sure to remove any glue squeeze out, because this could affect the saw as it's riding along the rail. Alright, so while we're waiting on the glue to dry, this is the perfect opportunity for you to go and hit that like button to let me know you're enjoying this video. It really helps me out and it helps my channel to reach more people. So, thank you. So once the glue is dried, now it's time to trim the extra material off our guide and leave a perfectly straight edge. This creates a perfectly fitting guide for our circular saw that will not only help us ensure that we always get perfectly straight cuts, but also reduces tear out. Now let's use our DIY track saws to clean up the edge that we cut freehand on our plywood. First we just make our mark on each end of the plywood. Then we line up our track on each of our marks and clamp it down so it doesn't move. Now just set the saw on the track and run it along the guide to get tear out free and perfectly straight cuts every time. Also, make sure that you actually set the depth of the blade on your circular saw before you make the cut, or you may do like I did and realize it afterwards and have to make the cut again. But luckily, since we're using the guide rail, I still get a perfect cut even with this mistake. Now that we have this 8-foot guide completed, the first thing you need to do is use this to make another one just like it. And then you take it and cut it into a 5-foot and a 3-foot version. With those three, you can cut just about anything. You have the 8-foot one so that you can cut down full lengths of plywood. The 5-foot one is perfect for cross-cutting full sheets of plywood. And then you have the smaller 3-foot version to do all of your smaller cuts. That way you're not having to lug out this big one for everything that you need to do. So if you'd like to see how these DIY versions do against an actual track saw, I did a comparison video on those that you can check out right over here. I went through all the pros and cons of a track saw versus circular saw with these DIY tracks. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure and hit that subscribe button if you haven't, and I'll see you next time.